morning. So I want to look this morning at Psalm 121, just the first two verses. Psalm 121 is a very familiar psalm. You might recognize these words as I read them to you. The psalmist begins by saying, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Now, it's perhaps not immediately obvious, but this psalm, I think, is dealing with the problem of anxiety and how to combat. It's given us, I guess, principles and ways to combat anxiety and anxious thoughts. Now, it's one of a number of psalms called the Psalms of Ascent. There was 15 altogether, and they're found from between Psalm 120 and 134. And these were songs, these were prayers sung by pilgrim worshippers as they made their way up to Jerusalem, to the great feasts that were held there in Jerusalem. Thus, they're called the Psalms of Ascent because they were sung as they ascended up to Jerusalem, as they ascended up to the temple. And Psalm 121 deals, I think, with a particular situation that would make a pilgrim worshipper anxious. And I think it uses that situation to speak to us about facing anxieties in our day-to-day life, in our life generally, because at the end of the psalm, it talks about our day-to-day life. It talks about our going out and our coming in. Now, as the psalmist makes his way up to Jerusalem, he says, I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does your help come from? Where does my help come from? Now, he doesn't tell us where he was, but it's most likely that he was on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. You see, pilgrim worshippers would often have to make their way through Jericho and then climb up through the hills towards Jerusalem. It was a notorious road. You might remember from Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan that it was a dangerous road. And so it was a road that had steep cliffs on one side, but then steep drops on the other side. And so if your foot was to slip or you were to stumble, that could be potentially fatal. But even worse than that, it was known for its kind of caverns and caves, and bandits and robbers would often jump out at people and rob them and leave them half dead. And so when he says, I'm lifting up my eyes to the hills, like, where does my help come from? He's saying, look, as I scan the hill terrain, as I contemplate its dangers, I can't really see where help would come from. The verb tense, lift up my eyes to the hills, is a continual present. And so in other words, it's like he's continually kind of looking round. He's anxiously thinking, how am I going to get through this? Where would help come from if I find myself in a difficult situation? Now maybe you're going to feel a little bit like that at the moment. You're looking around and there are things that are making you feel anxious and you're thinking, like, how am I going to get through this? Or where is any help going to come from? Now, in order to address his anxieties, the psalmist reminds himself of a number of truths about God. And what I find most interesting about the first two verses of this psalm is that although he's praying, he's singing to God, at the same time he's talking to himself. He said, I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the maker of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Now, maybe you think talking to yourself sounds just really weird, but the reality is we all do it. We all talk to ourselves internally. There's an internal dialogue that takes place in our minds. One study said that we talk to ourselves at a rate of about 200 words a minute. I just kind of encourage you to pause at times and think about the inner dialogue that happens in your mind and heart. Do you often replay tapes from the past, or is it very easy for your thoughts to turn to negative or anxious thoughts? We will only combat those thoughts if we learn to take them captive, as Paul tells us, but also if we talk to ourselves with God's truth. That's what the psalmist is doing here. That's what the psalmists often do. Let me just note a couple of things from verses 1 to 2 that he reminds himself of. Now, he proclaims many truths about God through this psalm. Well, he proclaims a number of truths, like that God is his keeper, God is his protector. But I think verses 1 and 2 is really foundational. He says, my help comes from the Lord. Now, the Lord is the word in Hebrew, Yahweh. So he's not just saying my help comes from God, but my help comes from Yahweh. Now, Yahweh was the name that God used when he revealed himself to Moses and to the people of God, and he made covenant with them. It was his, if you like, covenant name, the name that he gave to the people of Israel, his people. And so I think that the psalmist is reminding himself that his God was, in using this word Lord, Yahweh, he's reminding himself that this God that he looks to in his anxiety is a covenant-keeping God. A God who is committed to his people, a God of steadfast love. His helper is a God who is totally committed to him. But God not only has the heart to help him, he sees, but also the power. See, the word help or helper used there doesn't just refer to somebody who maybe comes alongside and helps out a little bit, is an aid to you, but it's someone with power assisting someone who needs power. So what sort of power does this Yahweh have, the Lord? Well, he reminds himself that he is the maker of heaven and earth. He's the creator of the whole cosmos. And so as the psalmist kind of scans the hills and he's anxiously thinking, I can't see if there's any help for me here, what does he do? Well, he looks above the hills. He looks to the maker of the hills. Today as you look at those things that maybe are making you anxious, will you lift your eyes to God? To the one who is powerful enough, who is loving enough, who is committed to you enough to carry you through? And also, will you intentionally combat your anxious thoughts with these truths? Why not take verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 120, chew on them, meditate on them as you go about your day, and let them speak to your heart. Let them combat your anxious thoughts.